Chapter 7. A Mad Tea Party. There was a table set out under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having a tea party at the Dormouse. At it. A Dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep, and the other two were using it as a cushion, resting their elbows on it and talking over its head. Very uncomfortably for the Dormouse, thought Alice, only as it sleeps, I suppose it doesn't mind. The table was a large one, but the three were all crowded together at one corner of it. No room! No room, they cried out when they saw Alice coming. There's plenty of room, said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in a large armchair at the one end of the table. Have some wine, said the March Hare. The March Hare said as encouraging tone. Alice looked all around the table, but there was nothing on it but tea. I don't see any wine, she remarked. There isn't any, said the March Hare. Then it wasn't very civil of you to offer it, said Alice angrily. It wasn't a very civil of you to sit down without being invited, said the March Hare. I don't know if it was your table, said Alice. It's laid out for a great many more than 3. Your hair wants cutting, said the Hatter. He had been looking at Alice for some time with great curiosity, and this was his first speech. You should learn not to make personal remarks, Alice said with some severity. It's very rude. The Hatter opened his eyes very wide on hearing this, but all he said was, why is a raven like a writing desk? Come, shall we have some fun now? Thought Alice. I'm glad they've begun asking riddles. I believe I can guess that, she said aloud. Do you mean that you think you can find out the answer to it? Said the March Hare. Exactly so, said Alice. Then you should say what you mean, said the March Hare. The March Hare went on. I do, Alice said. Alice hastily replied. At least I mean what I say, and that's the same thing, you know. Not the same thing a bit, said the Hatter. Why, you might just as well say that I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see. You might just as well say, added the March Hare, that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like. You might just as well say, added the Dormouse, which seemed to be talking in its sleep, that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe. It is the same thing to you, said the Hatter, and here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a minute, while Alice thought over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks, which wasn't much. The Hatter was the first to break the silence. What day of the month is it? He said, turning to Alice. He had taken his watch out of his pocket and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then and holding it to his ear. Alice considered a little and then said, the 4th. 2 days wrong, sighed the Hatter. I told you butter wouldn't suit the works, he added, looking angrily at the March Hare. It was the best butter, the March Hare meekly replied. Yes, but some crumbs must have gotten in as well, the Hatter grumbled. You shouldn't have put it on with a bread knife. The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily. Then he dipped it into his teacup and looked at it again, but he could think of nothing better to say than his first remark. It was the best butter, you know. Alice had been looking over his shoulder with some curiosity. What a funny watch, she remarked. It tells the day of the month and doesn't tell what o'clock it is. Why should it? Muttered the Hatter. Does your watch tell you what year it is? Of course not, Alice replied very readily. But that's because it says the same year for such a long time altogether, which is just the case with mine, said the Hatter. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. The Hatter's remark seemed to her to have not sort of meaning in it, and yet it was certainly English. I don't quite understand you, she said as politely as she could. The Dormouse is asleep again, said the Hatter, and he poured a little hot tea upon its nose. The Dormouse shook its head impatiently and said, without opening his eyes, of course, just what I was going to remark myself. You have you guessed the riddle yet? The Hatter said, turning to Alice again. No, I give it up, Alice replied. What's the answer? I haven't the slightest idea, said the Hatter. Nor I, said the March Hare. Alice sighed wearily. I think you might do something better with the time, she said, than wasting it asking riddles that have no answers. If you knew time as well as I do, said the Hatter, you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him. I don't know what you mean, said Alice. Of course you don't, the Hatter said, tossing his head contemptuously. I dare say you never even spoke to time. Perhaps not, Alice cautiously replied. But I know I have to beat time when I learn music. Ah, that accounts for it, said the Hatter. He wouldn't stand beating. Now, if you only kept a good terms with him, he'd do almost anything you liked. With the clock? For instance, suppose it were 9 o'clock in the morning, just time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint to time, and round goes the clock in a twinkling. 1:30, time for dinner. I only wish it was, the March Hare said to itself in a whisper. That would be a grand, certainly, said Alice thoughtfully. But then I shouldn't be hungry for it, you know. Not at first, perhaps, said the Hatter, but you could keep it at 1:30, and as long as you liked. Is that the way you manage? Alice asked. The Hatter shook his head mournfully. Not I, he replied. We quarreled last March, just before he went mad, you know, pointing with his teaspoon at the March Hare. It was at the great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Bat, How I Wonder Where You're At. You know the song, perhaps? I've heard something like it, said Alice. It goes on, you know, the Hatter continued, in this way. Above the world you fly, like a tea tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle. Here the Dormouse shook itself and began singing in its sleep. Twinkle, 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 and went on so long that they had to pinch it to make it stop. Well, I'd hardly finished this first verse, said the Hatter, when the Queen brawled out, He's murdering the time. Off with his head! How dreadfully savage, exclaimed Alice. And ever since that, the Hatter went on in a mournful tone. He wouldn't do a thing I asked. It's always 6 o'clock now. A bright idea came into Alice's head. Is that the reason so many tea things are put out here? She asked. Yes, that's it, said the Hatter with a sigh. It's always tea time, and we have no time to wash the things between whiles. Then you keep moving around, I suppose, said Alice. Exactly so, said the Hatter, as the things get used up. But what happens when you come to the beginning again? Alice ventured to ask. Suppose we change the subject, the March Hare interrupted, yawning. I'm getting tired of this. I vote the young lady tells us a story. I'm afraid I don't know one, said Alice, rather alarmed at the proposal. Then the Dormouse shall, they both cried. Wake up, Dormouse. And they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened its eyes. I wasn't asleep, it said in a hoarse, feeble voice. I heard every word you fellows were saying. Tell us a story, said the March Hare. Yes, please do, pleaded Alice. And be quick about it, added the Hatter, or you'll be asleep again before it's done. Once upon a time there were 3 little sisters, the Dormouse began in a great hurry, and their names were Elsa, Lacey, and Tilly, and they went to live at the bottom of a well. On what did they live on? Said Alice, who always took a great interest in questions of eating and drinking. They lived on treacle, said the Dormouse after thinking a minute or two. They couldn't have done that, you know, Alice gently remarked. They'd have been ill. So they were, said the Dormouse, very ill. Alice tried a little to fancy herself with such an extraordinary way of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much, so she went on. But why did they live at the bottom of a well? Take some more tea, the March Hare said to Alice, very earnestly. I've had nothing yet, Alice replied in an offhanded tone, so I can't take more. You mean you can't take less, said the Hatter. It's very easy to take more than nothing. Nobody asked your opinion, said Alice. Who's making personal remarks now? The Hatter asked triumphantly. Alice did not quite know what to say to this, so she helped herself to some tea, bread and butter, and then turned to the Dormouse, repeated her question, why did they live at the bottom of a well? The Dormouse again took a minute or two to think about it, and then said, it was a treacle well. There's such a thing. Alice was beginning very angrily, but the Hatter and the March Hare went on, shh, shh. And the Dormouse sulkily replied, if you cannot be civil, you'd better finish the story yourself. No, please, go on, Alice said humbly. I won't interrupt you again. I dare say there may be one. One indeed, said the Dormouse indigently. However, he consented to go on. So there was 3 little sisters. They were learning to draw, you know. And what did they draw? Said Alice, quite forgetting her promise. Treacle, said the Dormouse, without considering at all this time. I want a clean cup, interrupted the Hatter. Let's all move one place on. He moved on as he spoke, and the Dormouse followed him. The March Hare moved into the Dormouse's place, and Alice rather unwillingly took the place of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who got any advantage from the change, and Alice was a good deal worse off than before, as the March Hare had just upset the milk jug into his plate. Alice did not wish to offend the Dormouse again, so she began very cautiously. But I don't understand. Where did they draw the treacle from? You can draw water out of a water well, said the Hatter. So I should think you could draw treacle out of the treacle well. Stupid. But they were in the well, Alice said, the Dormouse not choosing to notice the last remark. Of course they were, said the Dormouse. Well, in. This answer so confused poor Alice that she let the Dormouse go on for some time without interrupting him. They were learning to draw, the Dormouse went on, yawning and rubbing its eyes, for it was getting very sleepy. And they drew all manner of things, and everything that begins with an M. Why with an M? Said Alice. Why not? Said the March Hare. Alice was silent. The Dormouse had closed his eyes by this time and was going off into a doze. But on being pinched by the Hatter, it woke up again with a little shriek and went on. That begins with an M, such as mouse traps, and the moon, and memory, and muchness. You know, you say things are much of muchness. Did you ever see such a thing as a drawing of muchness? Really now, you ask me, said Alice, very much confused. I don't think. Then you shouldn't talk, said the Hatter. This piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She got up in great disgust and walked off. The Dormouse fell asleep instantly, and neither of the others took the least notice of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping they would call after her. The last time she saw them, they were trying to put the Dormouse into the teapot. At any rate, I'll never go there again, said Alice, as she picked her way through the woods. It's the stupidest tea party I ever was at in my life. Just as she said this, she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right into it. That's very curious, she thought, but everything's curious today. I think I may as well go in at once. And in she went. Once more she found herself in the long hall and close to the little glass table. Now I managed better this time, she said to herself, and began by taking the little golden key and unlocking the door that led into the garden. Then she set to work nibbling at the mushroom. She kept a piece of it in her pocket till she was about a foot tall, and then she walked down the little passage, and then she found herself at last in the beautiful garden among the bright flower beds and the cool fountain. The Queen's croquet ground. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there was 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought this was a very curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them. And just as she came up to them, she heard one of them say, "Look, out now, 5. Don't go splashing paint over me like that." "I can't help it," said 5 in a sulky tone. 7 jugged my elbow, on which 7 looked up and said, "That's right. 5 always lay the blame on others." "You'd better not talk," said 5. "I heard the Queen say only yesterday you deserve to be beheaded." "What for?" said the one who had spoken first. "That's none of your business, too," said 7. "Yes, it is his business," said 5, "and I'll tell him it was for bringing the cook tulip roots instead of onions." 7 flung down his brushes and had just begun, well, of all the unjust things, when his eyes changed to fall upon Alice as she stood watching them, and he checked himself suddenly. The others looked around also, and all of them bowed low. "Would you tell me, please," said Alice, a little timidly, "why are you painting the roses?" 5 and 7 said nothing, but looked at 2. 2 began in a low voice, Why, the fact is, you see, miss, that this here ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake. And if the Queen was to find out, we shall all have our heads cut off, you know. So you see, miss, we're doing our best. Therefore, she comes to. And at this moment, 5, who had been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" And the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat on their faces. There was a sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked around, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners. Next to the 10 quarters, these were ornamented all over with diamonds, and walked 2 and 2 as the soldiers did. After those came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and all the little dears came jumping merrily along, hand in hand, in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognized the White Rabbit. It was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Then followed the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion. And at last, all of the grand processions came the King and the Queen of Hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought to not lie down on her face like the 3 gardeners, but she could not remember ever having heard of such a rule at processions. And besides, what would be the use of a procession, she thought, if the people had to lie low down on their faces so that they couldn't see it? So she stood where she was and waited. And when the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her. And the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" she said to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot!" said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently and turning to Alice. And then she wanted, "What's your name, child?" "My name is Alice," so please your majesty," said Alice very politely. But she added to herself, Why, they're only a pack of cards, after all. I needn't be afraid of them." "And who are these?" said the queen, pointing to the 3 gardeners who were lying around the rose tree. For you see, they were lying on their faces, and the patterns on their backs were the same as the rest of the pack. She could not tell whether they were gardeners, or soldiers, or courtiers, or 3 of her own children. "How should I know?" said Alice, surprised at her own courage. It's no business of mine." The queen turned crimson with fury after glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast. Began screaming, "Off with her head! Off with—" "Nonsense," said Alice very loudly, decidedly, and the queen was silent. The king laid his hand upon her arm and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, she is only a child." The queen turned angrily away from him and said to the knave, "Turn them over." The knave did so very carefully with one foot. "Get up!" said the queen in a shrill, loud voice. And the 3 gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the king, the queen, and the royal children, and everybody else. Leave off that," screamed the queen. "You make me giddy." And then, turning to the rose tree, she went on, "What have you been doing here?" "May it please your majesty," said Two in a very humble tone, going down on one knee as he spoke, "we were trying—" "I see," said the queen, who had meanwhile been examining the roses. "Off with their heads!" And the procession moved on, 3 of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners, who ran to Alice for protection. "You shan't be beheaded," said Alice, and she put them into a very large flower pot that stood near. The 3 soldiers wandered about for a minute or 2 looking for them, then quietly marched off after the others. "Are their heads off?" shouted the queen. "Their heads are gone, if it pleases your majesty," the soldiers shouted in reply. "That's right," shouted the queen. "Can you play croquet?" The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. "Yes," shouted Alice. "Come on, then," roared the queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. It's a very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the white rabbit, who was peering anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Hush, hush," said the rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself upon tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, "She's under sentence of execution." "What for?" said Alice. "Did you say what a pity?" the rabbit asked. "No, I didn't," said Alice. "I didn't think at all a pity. I said, what for?" "She boxed the queen's ears," the rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. "Oh, hush," the rabbit whispered in a frightened tone. "The queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late." And the queen said, "Get to your places," shouted the queen in a voice of thunder, and people began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or 2, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet game in her life. It was all ridges and furrows. The croquet balls were live hedgehogs, and the mallets live flamingos, and the soldiers had to double themselves up and stand on their hands and feet to make the arches. The chief difficulty Alice found at first was in managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away comfortably under her arm, and with its legs hanging down, but generally just as she got to its neck and straightened out, and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with its head, it would twist itself around and look up in her face with such a puzzled expression that she couldn't help bursting out laughing. And then she had got its head down and was going to begin again. It was very provoking. to find that the hedgehog that unrolled itself was in the act of crawling away. Besides all of this, there was generally a ridge, a furrow in the way whenever she wanted to send the hedgehog to. And as the doubled up soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground, Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once without waiting for turns, quarreling all the while and fighting for the hedgehogs. In a very short time, the queen was in a furious passion and went stomping about and shouting, "Off with his head!" or "Off with her head!" about once a minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy. To be sure, she had not as yet had any dispute with the queen, but then she knew that it might happen one minute. And then she thought, what would become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there are any left alive. She was looking about for some way of escape and wondering whether she could get away without being seen. Then she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin, and she said to herself, "It's a Cheshire cat. Now I shall have somebody to talk to." "How are you getting along?" "How are you getting on?" said the cat as soon as there was a mouth enough for it to speak with. Alice waited till the eyes appeared, then nodded. It is no use speaking to it, she thought, until its ears have come, or at least one of them. In another minute the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo and began an account of the game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think that there was enough of it now in sight, and no more of it appeared. "I don't think they play at all fairly," Alice began, in rather a complaining tone. "And they all quarreled so dreadfully one cannot hear oneself speak. And they don't seem to have any rules in particular. At least, if there are, nobody attends to them. You're no idea how confusing it is all. It is all the things being alive. For instance, there's the arch I got to go through next, walking about on the other end of the ground, and I should have croqueted the queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming." "How do you like the queen?" said the cat in a low voice. "Not at all," said Alice. "She's extremely—" Just then she noticed that the queen was close behind her, listening, so she went on. "Likely to win. That is hardly worth while finishing the game." The queen smiled and passed on. "Who are you talking to?" said the king, coming up to Alice, looking at the cat's head with great curiosity. "It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire cat," said Alice. "Allow me to introduce it." "I don't like the look of it at all," said the king. "However, it may kiss my hand if it likes." "I'd rather not," said the cat remarked. "Don't be imprudent," the king said. "Don't look at me at all like that." He got behind Alice as he spoke. "A cat may look at the king," said Alice, "and I've read that in some books, but I don't remember where." "Well, it must be removed," said the king very decidedly, and they called to the queen, who was passing at the moment. "My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed." The queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, with great or small. "Off with his head," she said, without even looking around. "I'll fetch the executioners myself," said the king eagerly, and he hurried off. Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going on, as she heard the queen's voice in the distance, screaming with passion. She had already heard her sentence 3 of her players to be executed for having missed their turns, and she did not like the look of the things at all, as the game was in such a confusion that she never knew whether it was her turn or not. So she went off in search of a hedgehog. The hedgehog was enraged in the fight, the hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice an excellent opportunity for croqueting one of them with the other. The only difficulty was that her flamingo was gone across the other side of the garden, where Alice could see it trying in a hapless sort of way to fly up into a tree. By the time she caught the flamingo and brought it back, the fight was over and both the hedgehogs were cut out of sight. But it doesn't matter, thought Alice. All the arches are gone from this side of the ground. She tucked it away under her arm that might not escape again, and went back to have a little more conversation with her friend. When she got back to the Cheshire Cat, she was surprised to find quite a large crowd collected around it. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, the king, and the queen, who were all talking at once, while all the rest were quite silent and looked very uncomfortable. The moment Alice appeared, she was appeared to by all three of the settled questions, and they repeated their arguments to her. Though, as they all spoke at once, she found it very hard to make out exactly what they said. The executioner's argument was that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it off from, that he had never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin at his time of life. The king's argument was that anything that had a head could be beheaded, and that you weren't to talk nonsense. The queen's argument was that if somebody wasn't done about it in less than no time, she'd have everybody executed all around. It was this last remark that made the whole party look so grave, anxious. Alice could think of nothing else to say, but it belongs to the Duchess. You should ask her about it. She's in prison, the queen said to the executioner. Fetch her here. And the executioner went off like an arrow. The cat's head began fading away the moment he was gone, and by the time he came back with the Duchess, it had entirely disappeared. So the king and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for it, while the rest of the party went back to the game. Chapter 9. The Mock Turtle's Story. You can't think how glad I am to see you again, you dear old thing, said the Duchess, as she tucked her arm affectionately into Alice's. They walked off together. Alice was very glad to find her in such a pleasant temper, and thought to herself that perhaps it was only the pepper that had made her so savage when they met in the kitchen. When I'm a Duchess, she said to herself, not in a very hopeful tone, though, I wouldn't have any pepper in my kitchen at all. Soup does very well without. Maybe it's always pepper that makes people hot-tempered, she went on, very much pleased at having found out a new kind of rule. And vinegar that makes them sour, and chamomile that makes them bitter, and the barley sugar, such things that make children sweet-tempered. I only wish people knew that, and then they wouldn't be so stingy about it, you know. She had quite forgotten the Duchess by this time, and was a little startled when she heard her voice close to her ear. You're thinking about something, my dear, and that makes you forget to talk. I can't tell you just now what the moral of it is, but I shall remember it in a bit. Perhaps it hasn't one, Alice ventured to remark. Tut, tut, child, said the Duchess. Everything's got a moral, if only you can find it, and she squeezed herself up close to Alice's side as she spoke. Alice did not much like her keeping so close to her, first because the Duchess was very ugly, and secondly because she was exactly the right height to rest her chin on Alice's shoulder, and it was uncomfortably sharp. However, she did not like to be rude, so she bore it as well as she could. The game's going on rather better now, she said, by the way of keeping up the conversation a little. 'Tis so, said the Duchess, and the moral of that is, it's a love that makes the world go round. Somebody said, Alice whispered, that it's done by everyone minding their own business. Ah, Well, it means much of the same thing, said the Duchess, digging her sharp little chin into Alice's shoulder, as she added on the moral of that is, take care of the sense, and the sound will take care of themselves. How fond she is of finding morals in things, Alice thought to herself. I dare you say, you're wondering why I didn't put my arm around your waist, the Duchess said after a pause. The reason is that I'm doubtful about the temper of your flamingo. Shall I try the experiment? He might bite, Alice cautiously replied, not feeling at all anxious in having the experiment tried. Very true, said the Duchess. Flamingos and mustard both bite. And the moral of that is, birds of a feather flock together. Only mustard isn't a bird, Alice remarked. Right, as usual, said the Duchess. What a clear way you have putting things. It's a mineral, I think, said Alice. Of course it is, said the Duchess, who seemed ready to agree to everything that Alice said. There's a large mustard mine near here, and the moral of that is, the more there is of mine, the less there is of yours. Oh, I know, Alice exclaimed, who had not attended this last remark. It's a vegetable. It doesn't look like one, but it is. I quite agree with you, said the Duchess, and the moral of that is, be what you would seem to be, or if you like it, put it more sharply, never imagine yourself not to be otherwise than what it might appear to others that once you were might appear to others that what you were and might have been was not otherwise than what you have been would have appeared to them to be otherwise. I think I should understand better, Alice said very politely, if I had it written down, but I can't quite follow it as you say it. That's nothing to what I could say if I choose, the Duchess replied in a pleased tone. Pray don't trouble yourself to say it any longer. And that, said Alice. Oh, don't talk about trouble, said the Duchess. I'll make you a present of everything I've said as of yet. A cheap sort of present, thought Alice. I'm glad people don't give birthday presents like that. But she did not venture to say it out loud. Thinking again, the Duchess asked, with another dig of her sharp little chin. I've a right to think, said Alice sharply, for she was beginning to feel a little worried. Just about as much right, said the Duchess, as pigs have to fly, then but here, to Alice's great surprise, the Duchess's voice died away, even in the middle of her favorite moral, and the arm that was linked into hers began to tremble. Alice looked up, and there stood the Queen in front of them, with her arms folded, frowning like a thunderstorm. A fine day, Your Majesty, said the Duchess began in a low, weak voice. Now I give you a fair warning, shouted the Queen, stomping on the ground as she spoke. Either you or your head must be off, and that is about half no time. Take your choice. The Duchess took her choice and was gone in a moment. Let's go on with the game, the Queen said to Alice, and Alice was too much frightened to say a word, but slowly followed her back to the croquet ground. The other guests had taken advantage of the Queen's absence and were resting in the shade. However, the moment they saw her, they hurried back to the game. The Queen merely remarked that a moment's delay would cost them their lives. All the time they were playing, the Queen never left off quarreling with the other players and shouting, "Off with his head!" or "Off with her head!" And those whom she sentenced were taken into custody by the soldiers, who, of course, had to leave off being archers to do this. And so that by the end of half an hour or so, there were no archers left, and all the players except the King, the Queen, and Alice were in custody under sentence of execution. Then the Queen left off, quite out of breath, and said to Alice, "Have you seen the Mock Turtle yet?" "No," said Alice. "I don't even know what a Mock Turtle is." "It's the thing the Mock Turtle soup is made from," said the Queen. "I've never seen one or heard of one," said Alice. "Come on, then," said the Queen, "and he shall tell you his history." As they walked off together, Alice heard the King say in a low voice to the company generally, "You are all pardoned. Come, that's a good thing," she said to herself, for she had felt certain unhappily at the number of executions the Queen had ordered. They were very soon come upon the Griffin, lying fast asleep in the sun. "If you don't know what a griffin is, look at the picture. Up, lazy thing," said the Queen, "and take the young lady to see the Mock Turtle, and to hear his history. I must go back and see after some executions," I ordered. And she walked off, leaving Alice alone with the Griffin. Alice did not quite like the look of the creature, but on the whole she thought it would be quite a safe place to stay with it as to go off after the savage Queen as she waited. The Griffin sat up and rubbed its eyes, and then it watched the Queen till she was out of sight, and then it chuckled. "What fun!" said the Griffin, half to itself and half to Alice. "What is the fun?" said Alice. "Why, she," said the Griffin. "It's all her fancy that they never execute nobody, you know. Come on." Everyone says "come on" here, thought Alice, as she went slowly after it. I've never was so ordered about before in all my life, never. They had not gone far before they saw the Mock Turtle in the distance, sitting sadly and lonely on a little ledge of rock. As they came nearer, Alice could hear him singing as if his heart would break. She pitied him deeply. "What is his sorrow?" she asked the Griffin, and the Griffin answered very nearly in the same words as before. "It's all his fancy that he hasn't got no sorrow, you know. Come on." And so they went to the Mock Turtle, who looked at them with large eyes full of tears and said nothing. "This here young lady," said the Griffin, "she wants to know your history." "She do?" I'll tell it her," said the Mock Turtle in a deep, hollow tone. "Sit down, both of you, and don't speak a word till I've finished." So down they sat, and nobody spoke for some minutes, and Alice thought to herself, "I don't see how he could ever finish if he does begin." But he waited patiently. "Once," said the Mock Turtle last, with a deep sigh, "I was a real turtle." These words were followed by a very long silence, broken by an occasional exclamation of "hurrah" from the Griffin, and a constant heavy sobbing of the Mock Turtle. Alice was very nearly getting up and saying, "Thank you, sir, for your interesting story," but she could not help thinking there must be more to come. As she sat still and said nothing, "And when we were little," the Mock Turtle went on at last, more calmly, still sobbing a little now and then, "we went to school in the sea. The master was an old turtle, and we called him Tortoise." "Why did you call him Tortoise if he wasn't one?" Alice asked. "We called him Tortoise because he taught us," said the Mock Turtle angrily. "Really, you are very dull. You ought to be ashamed of yourself for asking such a simple question," added the Griffin. And then they both sat silent and looked at poor Alice, who felt ready to sink into the earth. And at last the Griffin said to the Mock Turtle, "Drive on, old fellow. Don't be all day about it." And he went on in these words, "Yes, we went to school in the sea, though you may not believe it. I've never been." "I never said I didn't," interrupted Alice. "You did," said the Mock Turtle. "Hold your tongue," added the Griffin before Alice could speak again. The Mock Turtle went on. "We had the best of educations. In fact, we went to school every day." I've been to a day school, too," said Alice. "You needn't be so proud as all that." "With extras?" asked the Mock Turtle a little anxiously. "Yes," said Alice. "We learned French and music." "And washing?" said the Mock Turtle. "Certainly not," Alice said indignantly. Ah, then yours wasn't a really good school, said the Mock Turtle in a tone of great relief. Now, at ours, they had at the very end of the bill French, music, and washing extra. You couldn't have wanted it much, said Alice, living at the bottom of the sea. I couldn't afford to learn it, said the Mock Turtle with a sigh. I only took the regular course. And what was that? Alice inquired. Reading and writing. Of course, to begin with, the Mock Turtle replied, and then the different branches of arithmetic, ambition, distraction, uglyification, and diversion. I've never heard of fiction, Alice ventured to say. What is that? The Griffin lifted up both its paws in surprise. Never heard of uglifying? It exclaimed. You know what to beautify is, I suppose? Yes, said Alice dutifully. It's mean to make anything prettier. Well then, the Griffin went on, if you don't know what to uglify is, you're a simpleton. Alice did not feel encouraged to ask any more questions about it, so she turned to the Mock Turtle and said, what else had you learned? Well, there's a mystery, the Mock Turtle replied, counting off the subjects on his flippers. Mystery, ancient and modern. Seography, the drawing and the drawing master had an old congeries that used to come once a week. He taught us drawing, stretching, and fainting in coils. Well, was that what was all like? What was that like? Said Alice. Well, I can't show it you myself, said the Mock Turtle. I'm too stiff, and the Griffin never learnt it. Haven't the time, said the Griffin. I went to the classical master, though. He was an old crab, he was. I never went to him, the Mock Turtle said. With a sigh, he taught laughing and grief. They used to say, so he did, said the Griffin, sighing in his turn. Both creatures hid their faces and their paws. And how many hours a day did you do a lesson? Said Alice in a hurry to change the subject. 10 hours the first day, said the Mock Turtle, and 9 the next, and so on. What a curious plan, exclaimed Alice. That's the reason they called lessons, the Griffin remarked, because they lesson from day to day. This was quite a new idea to Alice, and she thought it over a little before she made her next remark. Then the 11th day must have been a holiday. Of course it was, said the Mock Turtle. And how did you manage on the 12th? Alice went on very eagerly. That's enough about lessons, the Griffin interrupted in a very decided tone. Tell her something about the games now. Chapter 10. The Lobster Quadrille. The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and drew the back of one flipper across his eyes. He looked at Alice and tried to speak, but for a minute or two sobs choked his voice, same as if he had a bone in his throat, said the Griffin, and it set to work shaking him and punching him in the back. At last the Mock Turtle recovered his voice, and with tears running down his cheeks, he went on again. You may not have lived much under the sea. I haven't, said Alice, and perhaps you were never even introduced to a lobster. Alice began to say, I once tasted, but checked herself hesitantly, and said, no, never. So you can have no idea what a delightful thing a lobster quadrille is. No, indeed, said Alice. What sort of a dance is it? Why, said the Griffin, you first form into a long line, the seashore. 2 lines, cried the Mock Turtle. Seals and turtles, salmon, and so on, and then you cleared all the jellyfish out of the way. That generally takes some time, interrupted the Griffin. And you advance twice, each with a lobster as a partner, cried the Griffin. Of course, the Mock Turtle said. Advance twice, set to partners. Change lobster and retire in the same order, continued the Griffin. And then, the Mock Turtle went on, you throw the lobsters, shouted the Griffin with a bound into the air, as far out to sea as you can. Swim after them, screamed the Gryphon. Turn a somersault in the sea, cried the Mock Turtle, capering about wildly. Change lobsters again, yelled the Gryphon at the top of his lungs. And back to land again, and that's the first figure, said the Mock Turtle, suddenly dropping his voice. And the two creatures who had jumped about like mad things all this time sat down again very sadly and quietly and looked at Alice. It must be a very pretty dance, said Alice timidly. Would you like to see a little of it? Said the Mock Turtle. Very much indeed, said Alice. Come then. Come, let's try the first figure, said the Mock Turtle to the Gryphon. We can do it without the lobsters, you know. Shall we sing? Oh, you sing? Said the Gryphon. I've forgotten the words. And so they began solemnly dancing around and around Alice, every now and then treading on her toes when they passed too close and waving their foreclaws to mark the time, while the Mock Turtle sang this very slowly and sadly. Will you walk a little faster, said I, whittling to a snail. There's a porpoise close behind us, and he's treading on my tail. See how eagerly the lobsters and the turtles advance. They're waiting on the shingle. Will you come and join the dance? Will you come? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance? You can really have no notion how delightful it will be when they take us up and throw us with the lobsters out to sea. But the snail replied too far, and gave a look of askew. He thanked the woodling kindly, but he did not join the dance. Would not, could not join the dance. Would not, could not join the dance. What matters is how far we go, his scaly friend replied. There's another shore, you know, upon the other side. The further off from England, the nearer to France. Then turn not pale, beloved snail, but come and join the dance. Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? Thank you. It's a very interesting dance to watch, said Alice, feeling very glad that it was over at last. And I do so like the curious song about the whittling. Oh, as to the whittling, the Mocking Turtle, you've seen them, of course. Yes, said Alice. I've often seen them at dinner. She checked herself hastily. I didn't know where din may be, said the Mock Turtle, but if you've seen them so often, of course you would know that they're like. I believe so, replied Alice thoughtfully. They have their tails in their mouths, and they're all over crumbs. You're wrong about the crumbs, said the Mock Turtle. Crumbs would all wash off in the sea, but they have their tails in the mouth, and the reason is... Here the Mock Turtle yawned and shut his eyes. Tell her about the reason and all that, he said to the Gryphon. The reason is, said the Gryphon, that they would go with the lobsters to the dance, so they've got to be thrown out to sea. So they had to fall a long way. So they got their tails fast in their mouth, so they couldn't get them out again. That's all. Thank you, said the Alice. It's very interesting. I never knew so much about whittlings before. I can tell you more than that if you like, said the Gryphon. Do you know why it's called a whittling? I never thought about it, said Alice. Why? It does the boots and the shoes, the Gryphon replied solemnly. Alice was sorely puzzled. Does the boots and the shoes? She replied in a wondering tone. Why, what are your shoes done with? Said the Gryphon. I mean, what makes them so shiny? Alice looked down at them and considered it a little before she gave her answer. They're done with blacking, I believe. Blacking and shoes under the sea, the Gryphon went on in a deep voice, are done with whitening. Now you know. And what are they made of? Alice asked in a tone of great curiosity. Soles and eels, of course. The Gryphon replied rather impatiently. Any shrimp could have told you that. And if I'd been the Witling, said Alice, whose thoughts were still running on the song, I have said to the purpose, keep back, please. We don't want you with us. And they were obliged to help him with them, the Mock Turtle said. No wise fish would go anywhere without a porpoise. Wouldn't it really? Said Alice in a tone of great surprise. Of course not, said the Mock Turtle. Why, if a fish came to me and told me he was going a journey, I would say, with what purpose? Porpoise. What do you mean? Don't you mean purpose? Said Alice. You mean what I mean what I said, the Mock Turtle replied in an offended tone, and the Gryphon added, come, let's hear some of your adventures. I could tell you of my adventures beginning from this morning, Alice said timidly, but it's no use going back to yesterday because I was a different person then. Explain all that, said the Mock Turtle. No, the adventures first, said the Gryphon in an impatient tone. Explanations take such a dreadful time. So Alice began telling them her adventures from the time when she first saw the White Rabbit. She was a little nervous about it. At first, the two creatures got so close to her, one on each side, and opened their eyes and mouth so very wide. But she gained courage as she went on. Her listeners were perfectly quiet till she got to the part about repeating, "You are old, Father William," to the caterpillar, and the words all came out differently. And the Mock Turtle drew a long breath and said, "That's very curious." "It's all about as curious as it can be," said the Gryphon. "And it came out differently," the Mock Turtle repeated thoughtfully. "I should like to hear her try and repeat something now. Tell her to begin." He looked at the Gryphon as if he thought it was some kind of authority over Alice. "Stand up and repeat. 'Tis the voice of the sluggard," said the Gryphon. "How the creatures order me about and make one repeat lessons, thought Alice. I might just as well be at school at once. However, she got up and began to repeat it, but her head was so full of the lobster quadrille that she hardly knew what she was saying, and the words came out very queer indeed. "'Twas the voice of the lobster," I heard him declare. "You were baked me too brown, and I must sugar my hair. As such a duck with his eyelids, so he with his nose trims his belt and his buttons, and turns his toes. When the sands are all dry, he is gay as a lark, and talk in the contemptuous tone of a shark. But when the tide rises and the sharks are around, his voice has a timid and tremendous sound." "That's different from what I used to say when I was a child," said the Gryphon. "Well, I never heard it before," said the Mock Turtle, "but it sounds uncommon nonsense." Alice said nothing. She had sat down with her face in her hands, wondering if anything would ever happen in a natural way. "I should like to have it explained," said the Mock Turtle. "She can't explain it," said the Gryphon hastily. "Go on with the next verse." "But about his toes?" the Mock Turtle persisted. "How could he turn them out with his nose, you know?" "It's the first position in the dance," Alice said, but she was dreadfully puzzled by the whole thing and longed to change the subject. "Go on with the next verse," the Gryphon repeated. "It begins, 'I passed by his garden.'" Alice did not dare to disobey, though she felt sure it would come out wrong, and then she went into a trembling voice. "I passed by his garden and marked with one eye how the owl and the panther were sharing a pie. The panther took a crust and gravy and meat, while the owl had the dish as it shared of the treat. And when the pie was all finished, the owl, as a boon, was kindly permitted to pocket the spoon, while the panther received knife and fork with a growl and concluded the banquet by, "What is the use of repeating all that stuff?" the Mock Turtle interrupted, "if you did not explain it as you go. It's by far the most confusing thing that I ever heard." "Yes, I think you'd better leave off," said the Gryphon, and Alice was only too glad to do so. "Shall we try another figure of the lobster quadrille?" the Gryphon went on, or would you like the Mock Turtle to sing you another song?" "Oh, a song, please, if the Mock Turtle would be so kind," Alice replied, so eagerly that the Gryphon said in a rather offended tone, "No counting for taste. Sing her turtle soup, will you, old fella?" The Mock Turtle sighed deeply and began, in a voice cracked with sobs, to sing, "Beautiful soup, so rich and green, waiting in a hot tureen. Who for such dainties would not stoop? Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup. Beautiful soup, who cares for a fish, game and other dish? Who would not give all else for 2 pennies worth only of beautiful soup? Pennies worth only of beautiful soup. Beautiful soup, soup, beautiful soup. Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup." "The chorus again," cried the Gryphon, and the Mock Turtle had just begun to repeat it when a cry of "The trial's begun!" was heard in the distance. "Come on," cried the Gryphon, and taking Alice by the hand, I hurried off without waiting for the end of the song. What trial is it?" Alice panted as she ran, but the Gryphon only answered, "Come on," and ran faster, while more and more faintly came carried on the breeze the melancholy words, "Soup of the evening, beautiful, beautiful soup."